Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Institute for Policy Research lecture. I'm Nick Pearce, the director of the Institute for Policy Research. This evening, we are here to discuss and debate how to stop bad data driving out the good in an age of misuse, misleadingness, and misinformation. This is an age where we are communicated to by the highest sources of executive power in the Oval Office in 10 Downing Street through Twitter and WhatsApp messages. We live in a world in which data proliferates and in which much of what we read we feel that we can no longer trust. Much of what we read we don't want to trust. And in these circumstances, democratic decision-making becomes more difficult. The ability to recognize sources of expertise, to be able to hold a dialogue between different positions based on recognized facts become much more problematic. So the role of those entrusted in our society with regulating statistics, with regulating at least some of the data that we encounter produced by government agencies, by public bodies and others, becomes a really important one. And so we are therefore delighted that to speak to us this evening we have Ed Humpherson, whose job it is to regulate the use of statistics in government. He is the Director General for regulation in the UK Statistics Authority, which is our regulatory body in the UK for the use of statistics. So this is a really demanding and challenging job at a time when some of the issues that we face in understanding, using data, using statistics in our democratic societies becomes incredibly hard. So we're very pleased to welcome you here this evening, Ed. We're really interested to hear what you have to say, and we'll have an opportunity for a full debate after we've listened to you speak. Thanks very much indeed.
A couple of years ago, I was going on a tube journey in London to a meeting with Universities UK. Universities UK are the representative body for universities, and they wanted to meet me because they had a beef about student migration statistics on how many students were migrating for the purposes of study to the UK from other countries in the world. They thought the statistics were rubbish, and they wanted me, as the regulator of statistics, to do something about it. And as is often the case with me, I was reading at the last minute before the meeting some relevant information from their website to kind of brief myself up on what we're going to talk about. So here I was on the tube reading this long report they'd written on student migration. I don't know if you know the geography of the London Underground. I was on the Victoria line going to Euston. I was travelling from Vauxhall, very crowded tube. At Oxford Circus, which is about halfway along that journey, I became aware, even though it was a crowded tube, of a woman standing next to me who was hurriedly opening up her bag, getting out a pen and a piece of paper, and starting to write on it. And I didn't really pay it very much attention. You kind of see this all the time. Maybe I thought she'd forgotten something she needed to do at work. Maybe she was writing a hurried birthday card. So I went back to reading my report on student migration. At the next station, Warren Street, she got off, picked up her bag and got off. But before she did so, she turned to me and she said, "I just have to give you this." And she gave me the piece of paper she'd been writing on. Now, I'm going to come back to what she wrote later in this talk. But can I just say that that's really not a normal occurrence, at least not for me. It's not something which normally happens to me. So thank you very much, Nick, for the invitation, and thank you to all of you for coming here. And thank you also for the three academics who I met earlier today to talk about various aspects of the role of information in society. Sam, who's here, is Yulia here? Yeah, and is Neil here? I don't think Neil is here. Well, let me say, any of you ever do this, come into an academic environment as a non-academic to give a lecture Don't ever say, I'd really like to meet the academics who are expert in the subject about 2 hours before we do the lecture, because there's nothing which is going to hammer your confidence more than realizing that you know about that much and they know about this much. So with apologies to the three of you for the kind of terrible, outrageously ill-informed things I'm about to say, let me proceed. So this talk is about thinking about living in a world where bad data could drive out good data. And I want to argue that whilst that's a real risk, while we can see this happening all around us, I think the risk is overstated, and I think it can be combated. I don't think bad data do need to drive out the good data. So let me begin with a couple of key concepts. The first is that when I talk about statistics, I'm thinking about statistics produced by government as a public asset. They're a public asset because they frame people's understanding of the world. How many people there are in the country, the size of the economy, the rate of inflation, the health of the population, the rate of crime, and many other things. And those things which help us understand the world, then in turn form a starting point for debate, for political debate, but also people making debates in their head about their personal choices. And I always think it's a mistake when people think that statistics like on the economy or on housing prices or on waiting times in hospitals, that those are just for kind of decision makers at the centre of government. They are for those people, but I think they're also much more widely useful for individuals, community groups, charities, trade unions, much wider range of actors in society. And because statistics serve all of those communities, all of those groups, we think of them as being a public asset. The second concept, which is going to run through this talk, is very important, which is for every single statistic that you ever hear, there is a producer who is responsible for that statistic. I think that's a really important habit of mind to get into, that the numbers have been produced and created by an individual or an organisation for a purpose. The producers I'm interested in are government departments, the Department for Health, the Office for National Statistics, the Treasury, the Scottish Government, the Department for Education. But of course, numbers are much more prominent in other walks of life, and every number you hear has a producer. So I'm going to talk about producers. And when I talk about producers, I'm not just thinking about the statisticians, the number crunchers. I'm thinking about the people who lead the organizations, the communications professionals, thinking a lot about politicians, the politicians who use what their departments create. That's what I mean by producers, the people who are responsible for the numbers that you hear. And the third concept which runs through is the concept of a regulator. And that's me. I'm the head of the Regulatory Authority for Statistics in the UK. Now, I'm not going to say a lot about this because this isn't really a promotional lecture. I'm not looking to sell to you how important we are or how great we are. If you want to have the promotional version, we have a conference in early November, which is going to be unashamedly a showcase of how great we are. So do let me know afterwards. I'll get you an invite to that. Just to say very briefly, what we do is we set standards that government must comply with when they publish statistics, and we enforce those standards, not just for how numbers are compiled and collected and presented, but also how they're used. And it's the use which I think is the most interesting part of this. So why do people think that there are threats? Nick referred to the threats right at the beginning. What's going on here? Well, I think it goes back to Thomas Gresham, who was, as I'm sure all of you will know, a banker in the Tudor times, banker to Elizabeth I, the Queen of England, very rich man, and he is known for his thinking on coinage. And his thinking on coinage, based on a really acute observation he made, which is that lots of governments in those days used to pay their armies with coins. and there's like a finite supply of coins, particularly in an era where coins had their face value. A gold coin was made of gold, a silver coin was made of silver. And that means they're quite expensive to make, right? And governments hit upon this really clever ruse, which was if you could just kind of debase the coin, if you could just kind of put in a little bit of alloy, cheaper stuff, just a little bit, it'd be much cheaper to make the coins, you could make more of them, and then you could pay for more armies. And that worked brilliantly until the armies, the soldiers, the people receiving the coins, figured out that they were getting a coin which was worth less, that the coin had been debased. And as soon as that happened, as soon as people twigged that they were being, in effect, lied to, what they would do is instead of continuing to use the less valuable coin is that they would withdraw from it altogether. They would stop using that coinage because they'd not know what to trust, they'd not know what was good or bad. But for that reason, they'd go and start using other currencies, which they would rely on. And Thomas Gresham identified this and said it's a really bad idea to debase your coinage because it leads people to stop using it altogether, that the bad money drives out the good. So that's the phrase, the bad money drives out the good. Although I should say, as somebody who spends my professional life berating people for not being clear about their sources, I have to add this, which is that Thomas Gresham never actually said that. This was something that a Victorian economist about 300 years later put into Thomas Gresham's mouth, but he never actually said anything like it. And I kind of like the irony of somebody who's famous for a law about counterfeiting, his most famous quote being itself counterfeit. I think there's a certain kind of circularity to that. So why is that relevant here? Well, Gresham's law, which is that the bad money drives out the good, is seen to be a metaphor for any situation in which the public lose confidence in the reliability, the trustworthiness of something that they're being offered. And when they lose confidence, they cash in their chips, they withdraw, they no longer know what to trust. The analogy applies to lots of situations. It can apply, and people use it to apply it to the world of information in our contemporary society. The argument goes like this, that people are so bombarded with information from all sources, some of which they know to be false, they've heard of fake news, they've heard of misinformation, that they no longer feel they have the ability to sift the useful from the useless. And therefore what they do is say, well, I'm cashing in my chips. I no longer know what to trust, what to believe in. I think it's all made up. I'm being served up a whole kind of, architecture of falsehoods. That's what people are worried about. So is there any evidence that this is happening? Well, I don't think you need to go very far to find people being concerned about exactly this phenomenon. Think about situations in British political life where there may have been some sense of statistics being used in a way that isn't entirely appropriate, maybe a misleading use of statistics. Now, I was hearing earlier from Sam Johnson about extrasensory perception and research into extrasensory perception. That is one of my gifts, and I actually am a mind reader, and I know that about 85% of you right now are thinking of a bus. As soon as I say misinformation in public life, you're thinking of a bus. I don't know what the other 15% of you are thinking. I'm not that skilled, but 85% of you immediately have an image of a bus in your mind. I'm not going to say much about the bus, but I think it's a very good jumping off point for a debate about, are we in an environment where people are starting to lose their confidence in statistics? And I think it's not just in Brexit debates. I have a book at home called Great Speeches of the 20th Century. Fantastic book. It's got all your favourites in it. I Have a Dream. It's got This Is Our Finest Hour. It's got Ask Not What Your Country Can Do For You. It's got all those fantastic speeches. And if you look through them, there's not a number in them. There's not a kind of a quantified claim that a fact checker would recognise as something they could go and fact check. By contrast, if you look at any speech made by any contemporary politician, it's an absolute bombing of numbers. It's a bombardment of numbers. If you look at the conference speeches made by the party leaders recently, they illustrate all of their points using numbers not clear what the provenance of the numbers is, but they like to feel as though it lends some credibility to them to kind of use numbers. And this is sort of what's creating, I think, a sense that we don't know where this is all coming from. This is a debasing by this kind of overuse. And it got me to think that what a great speech of the 20th century would be like if it was said today. So I don't know if you know the great Churchill speech, fighting on the beaches speech. I think if he did it today, it would go something like this. I can today announce we will fight on the beaches 17.3% of the time. We'll fight on the landing grounds 26.2% of the time. In the fields, 34.8% of the time. And thanks to my government's long-term plan, I can today announce we will fight in the streets for a further 21.8% of the time. Probably accompanied by a visualization, because people love their visualizations, probably by a visualization which doesn't really tell you anything. I should say, as a man who's keen on provenance, that's not an actual, Churchill never actually used that visualization. I think there's also, so there's a bombardment of numbers, and I think that's creating this debasing. I also think there's a series of threats to public reason. This is Honora O'Neill, the great political philosopher, and she's recently been talking about threats to public reason from digital communication. And the point that she makes is that in this age of abundant communication technologies, or information communication technologies, are often used not to communicate and not to inform, but to nudge, to grab attention, to manipulate. And one of the things that she thinks is going on there, which I think is a really acute observation, is that we spend a lot of time thinking about what it means for something to be public than what it means to be ethical or reasonable. So we talk about privacy, we talk about freedom of expression, we talk about freedom of the media and things like that, sort of institutional frameworks for making sure that the publicness of things is well understood. But we don't really spend any time talking about, well, what is ethical communication? She says things like veracity and integrity and honesty in communication are seen as somehow quaint, old-fashioned ideas, and she thinks that we've lost something in thinking in experiencing this feature of information and communication technologies. And you even see this in people who standing out against it. So people who talk about misinformation, worry about misinformation, spend a lot of time worrying about misinformation and what it means to misinform. They don't spend very much time saying what it means to inform, what good looks like. Really good example, look at a recent report from the Culture and Media Select Committee in the House of Commons on misinformation. Lots and lots of pages about what we should do about misinformation. Not a great deal on what misinformation is, and nothing on what good information is. And I think if we exist in that world, we're likely to feel as though our currency is constantly being debased. So I think there are good reasons why people are worried about bad data. And I think we need to recognize them. The world I'm responsible for is also responsible for some of this bad data. So it's not just that good statistics are produced by government and then they sort of go out into a world where there's lots of kind of casual misinformation. Quite often government misinforms with statistics directly itself. And I have three examples of this. There could be many more. So the first example is this is a tweet from the Department for Education. There is more money going into our schools than ever before. And it's got lots and lots of problems with it, lots of reasons why that's not a very good piece of information. Has anybody, very bright audience this evening, anybody got any ideas what's wrong with that? Very good. That's the most egregious thing. Sorry, funding per pupil's gone down. It's not in per pupil terms. There's one other problem with it. cash not real. So 3 immediate problems. It's cash not real, it's not in per pupil terms, so you don't know, whether the number of children being educated for this amount of money is right. But the most egregious thing is that it's starting at 36 billion, not at naught. I've given this lecture before, but no audience has ever got it so quickly, so well done for that. I should say, of course, I've been very clear on my provenance, where I'm getting all of this stuff from. This is an actual tweet. This is not one that I've made up. They actually did tweet this. Just correcting one of those mistakes, this is what my team did. We put the axis down to naught, and you see that whilst there is a very small increase, it's nowhere near as dramatic as that. And then correcting for the others, for the per pupil calculation and for the real terms, means that actually there's a slight drop. Really, really egregiously misleading. What this speaks to is a culture of communication by the department, which says, we just wanted a big number. Get us a big number, as big a number as we can. The next example is a press release by DEFRA, which had this fact in it. 8.5 billion plastic straws are thrown away each year in the UK. It's what we call a naked number. It has absolutely nothing to clothe it. It has no source, no explanation, nothing to help you get a sense of where that number comes from. It was just thrown in. Now, when a number is naked and you have no source or no context, you're driven back to your intuition. Like, does that seem like a big number or a small number? Does that seem plausible or not? As it turns out, I don't think it is a very plausible number, because we looked into this and it was taken from a report by some consultants whose methodology was to find out how many straws McDonald's they issue on a given day, multiply that by a year, and then multiply it by the proportion of the total food market represented by McDonald's to gross it up to the total number. I don't know if that's maybe the most reliable way, but the point is, I shouldn't even have to sort of do all that digging. It should be clear at the outset where this number comes from. A naked number, very, very poor way of communicating. And then the third example is, if you wanted to find out how many people were homeless in England and you went to the Ministry of Housing's website, you might find this sort of graph, which is a statistic about people in homelessness prevention and relief. And then you find this graph, which is people in this thing called statutory homelessness. And then you find this graph, which is a count of rough sleepers. You find these 3 things, kind of no explanation as to how they interrelate, whether they're the same people bouncing around these different categories, whether they're completely different. You'd be completely lost. The numbers wouldn't be so much naked as existing in silos, completely separate from one another, and no guidance to you as a member of the public to understand the phenomenon of homelessness in the round. Very, very poor communication of statistics. So my case is that it's not just that we live in a society where there's casual misinformation but really, really good statistics. Sometimes the statistics can be not very good. But sometimes the producers, those producers of statistics, do get it right. I've got 3 great examples. The first is life expectancy. So life expectancy is how long a baby born today can expect to live if she experiences the mortality rates in the general society at that time. Since 1971, life expectancy in the UK has been increasing at the rate of about 6 months a year. It's been going up and up and up until about 2013, when it stalled. Progress in increasing life expectancy has stalled. And in fact, there is some parts of the country where it looks like it's going backwards, that life expectancy is lower than it was. Now, those are just numbers. The key point to getting to them is to understand what sits behind them. The Public Health England have done this fantastic tool to get behind the numbers. This is figures for Liverpool, where they have identified what is explaining the gap in life expectancy in Liverpool between Liverpool and the England average. And you can see it's these different range of causes. And it's got real practical application, because in the other category, the bottom yellow one, there's, if you pick into that, there's actually quite a lot of accidental poisonings, drug drug deaths, misadventure with drugs, and that has led that area to do quite a lot of work to think about how to help people in those situations. It's a great example of not just presenting numbers nakedly or without context or in a misleading way, but presenting numbers to help drive people to understand a problem. That's not the only example. In the productivity debate, the ONS has done some amazing work to identify why it is that UK firms are not as productive or not increasing their productivity as they were. I won't go into the details, but they've done some tremendous kind of disaggregated work, again, going behind the number to understand what's driving it. And there's this lovely website called Ethnicity, Facts and Figures, which pools everything that government holds about public services and the distribution by different ethnicities of experience for things like employment, health, housing, criminal justice. And it's a fantastic website. Again, it's not just presenting individual numbers, it's presenting them in their context. And these are all really good examples of statistics that are doing their job to help people understand the world, not just presenting them with big numbers to try and persuade them. So, what am I drawing from my examples of really terrible use of statistics and really good use of statistics? Well, it's this, that if we want people to be confident in the numbers, we shouldn't just present big numbers like there's more money going into schools than ever before, or 8.5 billion straws. That's to treat the public with disrespect, and I think not a helpful way of communicating. What we need to do is present clear, disaggregated stories that relate things closely together to what's driving them. And I should say that in the examples that I gave of bad, in all three cases, in the straws, in the schools, and in the homelessness, we stepped in and did what regulators do and made a fuss about it. And in all three cases, there's been some really significant improvement by the departments. The Department for Education no longer puts out tweets as egregiously bad as that. The DEFRA now has a rule that it will never use a naked number in its press releases, so its chief statistician has to sign off the press releases. And only a couple of weeks ago, the Ministry of Housing published a blog which brought all its data sources together to give a rounded picture of homelessness in England compared to Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. So it's a real progress. And what they're really getting to is that statistics are not only not just a technocratic exercise of adding up some numbers and then putting them out into the world, and they're never just a number. A bit like a coin which is debased, a coin is not just a piece of metal, but it's a sort of socially constructed piece of value. So it is with statistics. They're about helping users understand the world. And if you want to help users understand the world, you can't just present them with numbers. You need to present them with explanation, context, disaggregation, and understanding. So that's how we think about statistics, is they're not just a number. They need to have this much broader sense of how they relate to the world and to lived experience. And although we're a very small organisation, we've created a framework which we call Trustworthiness, Quality and Value. And it's that framework that I think is really fundamental to making progress on this. It's got three pillars, the first of which is trustworthiness. So this is what we look for, whether it's DEFRA or the Scottish Government or any other producer. We start by looking for trustworthiness. And again, actually, this is from the same philosopher, Honora O'Neill. Trustworthiness is about providing usable evidence that allows others to check whether you are trustworthy. And the key point here is that you can't just expect to be trusted. You can't just say, I want you to trust me. You have to provide people with reasons or evidence to demonstrate that you are worthy of trust. And in the context of statistics, that is demonstrating that the statistics are produced free from political interest. And you can make specific commitments, and we require these commitments. For example, we expect any government department to announce at least a month in advance the day on which it's going to publish its statistics. at 9:30 and to not shift that time around. Now, any of you who spent any time in government know it's the trade of government to pick its news cycle moment to make announcements. So the fact that we require and force government departments to pick a day a month in advance takes away that driver to politically communicate or to bury bad news. They have to publish on the day they say, otherwise they're in breach of our code of practice, and they do stick to it. In fact, most of the breach reports I receive are when they miss by 2 minutes. That's how seriously it's taken. And a whole series of other commitments which are designed to show we'll make a commitment and then we'll be tested about it. It's trustworthiness. The second pillar is quality, and it goes to the heart of many of the things I've been talking about, which quality is not just about accuracy. It's not whether the number is sort of right. It's about whether it's a good estimate of what it's trying to measure and whether it's materially misleading or not. And that's what we look for. We're very influenced by a very brilliant statistician some of you will have heard of called David Spiegelhalter. He's just written a great book about statistics. And his view is that statisticians need to be willing to say their numbers are estimates. They're not like precise and unquestioned reflections of reality, but they're estimates, and they need to communicate that and communicate their confidence about that. So that's what we look for under quality. And under value, and in some ways this is the most important, which is that statistics, you can be trustworthy and high quality about something that isn't very useful for people. You know, you could produce very trustworthy statistics published exactly on the day you said you're going to publish them, with a very, very plausible estimate, not materially misleading, of how many paper clips there are on people's desks in government departments. But that wouldn't be a very valuable statistic. There wouldn't be a user question that would be addressing. So we look for value as well. We want to understand what is the question that these statistics help to answer, and how is the government department helping people answer it. The homelessness example is a classic one. People don't really want to know how many people there are in each of these three different categories of statutory homelessness, prevention, and rough sleeping. What they want to know is how many people have the lived experience of being homeless. They want to know the integrated picture. That's what value seeks to address. So my conclusions are quite optimistic, I think. The first is that the victory of bad data isn't inevitable, but what it depends on is the producers, the people who are responsible for communicating statistics, doing the right thing. And if they do the right thing, they won't be in this game of debasing the currency by excessive use of single numbers which sound big, or naked numbers. And the way that they do that is by focusing on trustworthiness, quality, and value. And what we really think, and I think that with a sort of ecosystem of my organisation, fact checkers, sort of responsible journalists, actually we can turn Gresham's law on its head and find that the good data, the good statistics, drive out the bad ones. And I think that's what we aim for, and I think it's eminently achievable by following these conclusions. So let me close by going back to my tube journey. So the piece of paper that I was handed on the tube, I was going to this meeting about student migration, I was reading the report, and I got handed this piece of paper, and it wasn't rude, it wasn't that personal. It said this, and I'm going to read it because I've still got it, and it's in the woman's handwriting. Do you know how the ONS study on students will be used? Are they trying to limit the number of international students? Why are they asking for this info right now? Sorry to be nosy, I'm just concerned. Now, there's an answer to her question. She left, I couldn't give her an answer to the question. But the point is, here was someone, a member of the public, who was deeply concerned about statistics. She wanted to know whether the statistics were good, not bad. She wanted the good data to drive out the bad. And that's what I think we should all want to do. Thank you very much.